They say war ends when the shooting stops. I used to believe that. I don't anymore. Because for me, the war never really ended. It just changed its voice. It started speaking through letters I could never send. Letters addressed to the men who never made it out of that field near Caen. Men whose names were still written on the dog tags I kept in my pocket long after the armistice was signed. My name doesn't matter much now. I was just another private in a regiment that no longer exists. One of the hundreds that crossed Normandy as green fields in the summer of 1944. We were told we were liberators, carrying light into the darkness. But liberation, I learned, casts its own kind of shadow. It began on a morning that looked too peaceful for what was coming. The hedgerows smelled of wet soil and smoke. The sky was that pale blue that always felt wrong in wartime, too innocent, as if the world hadn't yet realized what man was doing to it. My unit had been awake for 48 hours. Sleep had become a rumor. We lost our sergeant to a mortar shell the night before. What was left of him fit into a single blanket. I was promoted on the spot, not because I was brave, because I was still breathing. There's a strange hierarchy in survival. It doesn't reward courage, it rewards chance. You start to feel guilty for every step you take. Each breath feels borrowed, every moment stolen from someone who deserved it more. That morning, as we advanced through a narrow lane lined with apple trees, I saw Corporal Mason walking ahead of me, humming under his breath. He always did that when he was scared. It was his way of pretending control, turning fear into rhythm. Then mid-note, he just wasn't there anymore. The shell landed before the sound reached us. No scream, no warning, just light, noise, and a fine red mist that clung to our uniforms like dew. I remember crouching, trembling, waiting for the next one. When it didn't come, I saw what was left of him. A single boot, a torn sleeve, the smell of burned wool. Someone shouted orders, but I couldn't hear them over the ringing in my head. I just stared at that boot, the mud still clinging to the sole, and thought he was humming. A second ago he was humming. That night when the shelling stopped, I found a scrap of paper in my kit. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was shock. Maybe I wanted to keep him alive somehow. I started to write, "Mason, I don't know where you went, but I hope it's quiet there. The sky cleared tonight. You'd like that. You always hated the rain." I folded the paper, sealed it in an empty ration tin, and buried it under the same apple tree where he died. I told myself it was nothing, just a way to pass the time, a superstition. But it didn't stop there. Each time someone fell, I wrote another, a letter to Davies, who never learned his newborn's name, to Clark, who carried a photograph of his mother and swore she could feel when he was in danger, to Evans, who made us laugh even when our rations froze solid. I wrote because I couldn't speak, because if I didn't, their absence would crush me. I never told anyone. The others drank or prayed. I wrote. By the end of the war, I had more letters buried in Normandy than I could count. When the guns finally fell silent, I expected peace. Instead, I felt hollow. The silence wasn't comforting. It was deafening. The world celebrated victory, but my hands still trembled. The faces of the men I'd written to followed me everywhere. On the train back to London, I thought I heard Mason's humming again, faint but clear, like a memory refusing to fade. I took a job at the post office, ironic I suppose, handling letters for the living while hiding letters for the dead. Every day I sorted envelopes, stamps, and return addresses, and thought about all the words that never reached their destination. One evening, the supervisor handed me a stack of undelivered mail. Dead letters, he called them, envelopes without recipients. I stared at the pile for a long time. Something inside me shifted. That night, after everyone had gone, I opened the drawer where I had hidden a few of my old wartime letters, ones IAD carried home without meaning to. I placed them among the undelivered mail. It felt right, as if they finally belonged somewhere. A week later, a woman came to the post office. She was thin, with eyes that looked like they'd cried too much to bother anymore. She handed me an envelope, creased, stained, and addressed simply to my son somewhere in France. The handwriting shook. She said it had been returned to her unopened years ago. "Could you try again?" she asked. I hesitated, then nodded. That night, I added her letter to the ones I'd written. I don't know why. Maybe because it deserved to rest with the others. Maybe because I wanted them to have company. The next morning, when I passed the sorting room, I thought I smelled smoke, just faintly like burnt paper. But there was no fire, only the quiet hum of machines and the endless shuffle of envelopes. A few days later, her letter disappeared. No one knew where it went. The clerk swore the pile hadn't been touched. I didn't tell anyone that mine were gone too. Every last one. For the first time in years, I slept through the night. Weeks passed. The world was rebuilding itself, streets filled with laughter again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had read those letters. Not as ghosts or miracles, but as memory itself refusing to die. Because memory, I realized, is its own kind of afterlife. I started writing again, not for the dead this time, but for the living, for those who had to carry the silence left behind. I wrote about Mason's humming, Davies's jokes, Evans's smile. I sent the stories to the families anonymously. Most never replied. Some sent thank you notes addressed simply to a friend. And then one day I received a letter myself. No return address, no stamp, just my name written in a hand I didn't recognize. Inside was a single sentence. "We heard you." No signature. I stared at it for hours. I still don't know who sent it, maybe one of the families, maybe not, but it didn't matter. For the first time since the war, I felt something close to peace. Not the kind they promised in the newspapers, the kind that comes from knowing you've finally been heard. They say writing is confession, that words can absolve even the heaviest sins. I don't know if that's true. I only know that every letter I wrote carried a piece of me with it, and maybe, in some strange way, those pieces found their way back. Because when I walk past a postbox now, I still pause for a moment. I listen. And sometimes, when the wind is right, I could swear I hear Mason humming again, soft, almost happy, as if reminding me that even the dead deserve to be written to. London was rebuilding itself brick by brick, as if it could somehow erase the sound of sirens by stacking enough stone on top of the past. I moved through that reconstruction like a ghost, alive but not truly living. I'd survived the war, yes, but I'd never left it. It clung to me, the way the smell of gunpowder lingers long after a rifle's been cleaned. The post office was steady work, predictable, the kind of place where routine could hide the noise in your head. Every morning, I'd take my seat at the sorting desk, arrange the envelopes by region, and lose myself in the rhythm of paper and ink. It was mechanical, almost soothing, until one morning a return envelope stopped me cold. The handwriting was mine, the ink, the slope of the letters. It was identical to the ones I'd used during the war for my letters to the dead. Only this one was addressed to me. The date stamp read 2 days prior. The envelope was blank except for a single word. Continue. I froze. Rational thought gave way to instinct. I looked around the sorting room, half expecting someone to be watching. No one was. The other clerks went about their work, oblivious. I opened the envelope slowly, half dreading what I'd find. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, empty, no words. Just the faint scent of wet earth, like Normandy after rain. For the rest of the day I couldn't concentrate. That smell, it wasn't possible. It wasn't memory. It was physical. My hands trembled so badly I dropped 2 stacks of mail. The supervisor barked at me to take the afternoon off. I walked home through the fog, clutching the envelope in my pocket like a secret too heavy to carry. That night, I set the letter on my desk and stared at it. Every part of me wanted to dismiss it as coincidence, a prank, a trick of memory. But a part of me, the part that still believed the dead had ears, whispered otherwise. Continue. Continue what? Writing, remembering, surviving. I poured a glass of whiskey and sat down with a blank sheet of paper. My hand moved before my mind did. I wrote, "To whoever reads this, if anyone does." I kept my promise. I wrote to them all. I buried the words, but they didn't stay buried. If you want me to continue, I will. But tell me what you want me to say. I folded it neatly, placed it in an envelope and left it by the window. The next morning it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Not from fear exactly, but from a kind of alertness. The same kind I'd felt in foxholes waiting for dawn, knowing something was about to happen. Days passed. No more letters. I started to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I had written it, half asleep, lost in some waking dream of guilt. My mind had never fully returned from the war. That much I knew. Then, one evening, as I was closing up the post office, a young woman approached the counter. She couldn't have been more than 25. Brown coat, gloves, the look of someone who had aged too fast. She held a letter in both hands. "It came to my address," she said quietly, "but it isn't mine. I looked at the envelope. No return address, no stamp. Just a single word written across the front, for the one who remembers." She frowned. "Do you know what it means?" I didn't answer. My throat had gone dry. She smiled politely as if embarrassed. Strange thing, really. It was on my doorstep this morning. I almost threw it away, but something told me to bring it here. "Can I see the letter?" I asked. She nodded and handed it to me. My fingers shook as I opened it. Inside was a single line, written in my own handwriting again. "She still waits by the apple tree, Normandy, Mason's tree." My heart thudded so loud I thought she'd hear it. "Is something wrong?" she asked. I forced a smile. "Just a mistake, I think." "Thank you for bringing it in." She nodded, though she looked unconvinced. As she turned to leave, she hesitated. "If you find out who it belongs to, would you let me know?" "I will," I lied. That night I didn't go home. I went to the archives instead. Military records, transport logs, anything that might connect me to that name, to that field. I hadn't been back to France since the war ended. Most of the men's bodies had been recovered or buried in official cemeteries. But not all. Not Mason's. He was listed as missing, presumed dead. The next morning, I bought a ticket on the ferry to Calais. I told no one. Normandy was colder than I remembered. The air smelled of salt and ash, and the villages were quiet, as if they were still listening for the echoes of artillery. I rented a bicycle and followed the old road toward Caen, guided by instinct more than memory. The hedgerows had grown thick again, hiding the scars. But when I reached that lane, the one with the apple trees, I knew the trees were still there, older now, twisted and blackened at the tips. I walked to the base of the one where Mason had fallen. The ground had sunk slightly, just enough to show the outline of disturbed soil. I knelt and brushed away the dirt. The tin box was still there, rusted, fragile, but intact. I opened it slowly. Inside was the letter I'd written to him. The paper yellowed, edges curled. But there was something else now, a second sheet, folded beneath mine. "You kept your word," it said. So did I. I felt the air leave my lungs. The handwriting wasn't mine. I stumbled back, the world tilting. It wasn't terror I felt, it was recognition. Like reading a sentence you already knew before your eyes saw the words. I sat there until dusk, holding the two letters. The wind moved through the branches, carrying the faint sound of something that might have been humming. When I returned to London 2 days later, I brought the tin with me. I placed it on my desk, unopened after that. I didn't need to read it again, but the letters didn't stop. Every week one appeared, sometimes in my locker, sometimes slipped through my door. Always the same style, always personal. As if whoever or whatever was writing them knew what I'd done, what I'd thought, even what I'd dreamed. They weren't threats. They were reminders. Each one referenced something from the war that no one else could have known. The night Evans sang, "Home Sweet Home," before the charge. The bridge where Clark dropped his rifle, but didn't bend to pick it up. The sound of Mason's last note. Details too small, too intimate to be coincidence. I tried burning one. The paper turned to ash easily enough, but the next morning it was back on my desk. Clean, unburnt, folded precisely as before. I stopped trying to explain it. Logic has limits. Grief doesn't. Over time, the letters began to change. They stopped speaking about the past and started asking questions. Do you still believe survival was chance? Would you write again if it meant peace? What do you owe to the dead? Each question dug into me like shrapnel. I started keeping a journal, not of the letters, but of my own thoughts, the things I'd never said aloud. I wrote to answer them, to keep my mind from unraveling. But sometimes, when I read back what I'd written, there were lines I didn't remember writing, and they didn't sound like me. I stopped showing up to work the day I found my own handwriting on a letter I hadn't written. The manager sent a notice to my flat asking if I'd fallen ill. I crumpled it without reading. How could I explain that I was corresponding with ghosts, or worse, with a version of myself that refused to stay buried? I started staying home, curtains drawn. My days divided between staring at the pile of letters and trying to ignore the soft sound of paper shifting when no wind touched it. At first I thought the letters were a symptom, a fragment of a broken mind. But then, one morning, I woke to find the ink on one of them still wet. Someone had written it during the night. The words were brief: "You're not done yet." I told myself it had to be someone's cruel joke. Maybe an old comrade, someone who'd found my letters after the war. But every name I could think of was either dead or had drifted so far into civilian life they wouldn't have remembered me. The next letter was different. It wasn't written in my hand, or any hand I recognized. The writing was elegant, deliberate, military penmanship from a generation before mine. Do you believe in mercy even when it's undeserved? I stared at that question for hours. When I finally slept, I dreamt of the field hospital. I saw faces I'd forgotten, or tried to. The wounded calling for medics who never came. The bodies lined up by rank, not by need. And Mason again, his eyes open, the same look of disbelief frozen in them. When I woke, there was dirt under my fingernails and mud on the floor by the bed. I began to write again, not because I wanted to, but because the silence between the letters was unbearable. I wrote to each of them, Mason, Clark, Evans, addressing them as if they were alive. I confessed things I'd never said aloud. How I hesitated before giving an order that cost lives, how I'd chosen self-preservation over loyalty more than once. But the strangest part wasn't the relief. It was that sometimes, when I finished writing, I found replies. They weren't always full letters. Sometimes a single line added to the page in unfamiliar handwriting. Once, under one of my confessions, a sentence appeared hours later. "We forgave you long before you forgave yourself." The ink was darker, older, as if written years before I'd ever held the page. I thought about bringing the letters to a priest. Then I remembered the look one had given me after the war, when I'd tried to talk about the voices I'd heard in the ruins. He told me to pray harder. That was all, but I didn't need prayer. I needed understanding, or at least an explanation, so I visited an old comrade, Sergeant Fuller. He'd lost an eye in the Ardennes and spent his post-war years as a night watchman near King's Cross. When I told him about the letters, he didn't laugh. He just listened, silent, pipe smoke curling around his one good eye. Finally, he said, "You ever think maybe you never came back?" "What do you mean?" He leaned forward. "We all died out there in some way. Some parts of us just didn't realize it yet. It sounded poetic then. Later it felt prophetic. A week later, Fuller was dead. Heart attack, they said. When I went through the paper that morning, his obituary was marked with an X in pencil by someone who had already read it. That same day, a new letter arrived. "It's time to finish what you started." Inside the envelope was a train ticket. Destination, Portsmouth. I hadn't been to Portsmouth since before the invasion, before everything. The thought of returning felt like reopening an old wound. But curiosity or compulsion overpowered fear. The journey south was uneventful, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I caught my reflection in the train window, the tired face of a man who'd aged too much in peace and too little in purpose. When I arrived, the city felt different. Half rebuilt, half forgotten. I walked to the docks, drawn by something I couldn't name. At the far end, beyond the warehouses, stood a derelict pier, cordoned off by rusted wire. On one of the posts, half buried under a layer of dust, was an envelope. My name written across it. Inside was a single page. "You wrote to us from the ruins. Now it's our turn." And beneath it a second line written in handwriting I recognized as Mason's. "The sea remembers what the earth forgets." That night, I stayed in a small inn near the harbor. Sleep came in short, violent bursts. I dreamt of waves whispering names, of letters floating on the tide, like ghosts seeking harbor. When I woke, the room was cold, the window cracked open. Another envelope rested on the nightstand. This one was wet with seawater, no words, just a single object inside, a dog tag, Mason's, that broke something in me. I left the inn before dawn and went straight to the shoreline. The tide was coming in, grey and merciless. I walked until the water reached my knees, holding the tag like a relic. "I kept writing," I whispered. "Isn't that enough?" The sea didn't answer, of course, but for a moment I thought I heard something beneath the waves, not words, but a low, rhythmic pulse like breathing. When I returned to London, I sealed all the letters in a box and locked it in the wardrobe. I told myself I was done, but the quiet didn't last. 3 nights later, my neighbor, Mrs. Turner, knocked on my door, holding an envelope. "Postman must have mixed this up," she said. "But it has your name. It wasn't my address on the front. It was the name of the village near Caen, the one we'd bombed by mistake, where the letters had begun. Inside was a photograph, black and white, edges burned. It showed a group of soldiers standing beside an apple tree. I was one of them, but here's the thing, Mason was too, and he was smiling. There was writing on the back. We finally got the picture right. That night, I tore the photograph in half, burned both pieces, and buried the ashes in the garden. But even now, I sometimes find bits of blackened paper caught between the pages of my books, as if the fire never finished its work. I don't know what's real anymore. The world after war feels like a mirror cracked down the middle, one side reflecting what is, the other what refuses to die. Still, I keep writing. I tell myself it's for my own sanity, though deep down, I know the letters aren't just mine. They belong to something older, something that feeds on remembrance itself. Maybe the dead don't speak to us. Maybe we just learn to listen to what we've tried too hard to forget. I used to think that memory faded with time, that if you waited long enough, the ghosts would lose interest and move on to more restless souls. But the truth is, ghosts aren't what linger, guilt is. And guilt never learns how to die. Weeks passed after Portsmouth. The letters stopped coming, but their silence was worse than their arrival. Every night I'd find myself sitting at the desk, pen in hand, waiting for something. A whisper, a flicker, a reason to write again. The world outside my window kept moving. Cars, laughter, the smell of bread from the bakery below. All the things that belong to the living. But I didn't feel like one of them anymore. It was in early winter when the typewriter started typing by itself. It was an old Remington I'd bought second-hand for work, a heavy relic that required patience and force. That night, I was reading one of my own letters, the one addressed to Mason's mother that I'd never sent, when the machine on the desk gave a single metallic clack. Then another, then a third. I froze. The keys pressed one after another, deliberate, slow. The ribbon moved like a pulse. When it stopped, I stepped closer. The words were faint, typed unevenly. "The river runs backward." I didn't know what it meant, but something in the phrasing, the rhythm, the ambiguity, reminded me of Mason. He used to talk in metaphors when he was nervous. The next night, the typewriter spoke again. "You built a bridge of letters," it said. "Now walk across," and I did. I began writing not with pen, but on that machine, as if obeying a command from the beyond. Each page felt heavier than paper, as if every word added weight to something invisible I was carrying. I didn't even need to think anymore. The sentences seemed to form themselves. At first, the messages were almost gentle, reflections, apologies, fragments of memory. But slowly they began to shift. The tone grew darker. The words no longer sounded like mine. "You didn't bury us," one page read. You kept us standing in the rain. Ink is no substitute for repentance. Every letter you wrote was a prayer you didn't believe in. I tore those pages apart, threw them into the fire. But in the morning, I'd find new ones lying neatly on the desk, carbon copies of what I had destroyed. That was when I realized the typewriter didn't need me to write. It only needed my attention. I thought about leaving London again. But every train station I passed seemed to hum faintly, like wires charged with static. Once, while waiting at Victoria Station, I swore I saw Mason standing on the opposite platform. His uniform was soaked, mud-streaked, his face blurred by the reflection of the glass. When the train passed, he was gone. That night, I typed a letter addressed to him, not as a confession this time, but as a plea. "Tell me what you want," I wrote. "Tell me how to make it stop." The reply came before dawn, not typed, not mailed, but carved into the wood of my desk. "Finish the story." The next morning, the postman delivered an envelope sealed in wax. There was no return address, only a symbol, a small cross, drawn in what looked like soot. Inside was a single page, yellowed with age. The text wasn't typed. It was written by hand. But it was my handwriting. It was dated June 12, 1944, the day after the bombing at Caen. I knew then that I was no longer writing about the past. I was writing within it. The pages that followed came faster than I could keep track of them. Each one retold an event I'd lived, but not quite the same. In one version, Mason survived. In another, I was the one who died. Some described things I could never have known. The aftermath of raids I wasn't present for, conversations whispered by men already dead. One evening, I found a page that ended mid-sentence, as if interrupted. "We saw you standing there, not as you were, but as you would be." And then nothing. Blank space. I tried to type the rest, but the machine jammed, the carriage frozen halfway across the line. When I forced it open, the ribbon split. Inside the spool was another folded piece of paper, old, creased and water-stained. The writing was faint but legible. "Meet us where it began." I didn't need to think twice. I packed a small bag, took the first train to Dover, then a ferry across to France. My hands trembled the entire journey, but I couldn't stop. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was duty, or something close to it. The ruins near Caen hadn't changed much. Nature had softened the scars, moss over brick, vines reclaiming concrete, but the air still smelled of old ash and iron. I walked the same road we'd taken the night of the raid. It was quiet now, except for the wind threading through broken windows. In the center of what had once been a square stood the remains of a fountain, half collapsed. Beneath it I saw something glinting, metal half buried in mud, a box. It was rusted, dented, but unmistakably military issue. My initials were etched faintly on the lid. I couldn't remember ever owning such a box, but when I opened it, I found exactly what I'd been writing for years. Letters, dozens of them, each addressed in my own hand, but sealed and unopened. I picked one at random and tore it open. Inside was a single line. "You're the one who stayed behind." Another said, "We wrote so you wouldn't forget. You forgot anyway." And another, "We carried your words across the sea." I fell to my knees in the mud, the letters scattering like wounded birds. The wind tore them from my hands, sending them spiraling through the ruins. For a moment it looked like snow, a storm of ghosts. Then I heard voices, not shouting, not calling, whispering, layers of them, overlapping, like the echo of men speaking through time. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew the cadence. Every syllable was familiar, shaped by the same cold nights, the same fear. The dead don't speak in sentences. They speak in memory, I tried to answer. My voice cracked. "I'm sorry," I said over and over like a mantra. "I'm sorry for what I did, for what I didn't do." The wind quieted. The air grew still, and then, for the first time, I heard a single clear voice. "Mason's." He said, "We were never waiting for your apology." I turned, but there was no one there, only the fountain, the letters, and the reflection of the sky in the shallow water at my feet. But in that reflection, I didn't see myself. I saw all of them, The faces blurred together, a collage of everyone I'd ever failed, every man I'd written to, every name that had haunted the silence. They were smiling, not forgiving, not accusing, just present. When I blinked, the water was clear again. The letters were gone. I walked back toward the station, the sun already setting behind the ruins. I didn't take the typewriter with me. I left it there inside the fountain, its metal casing reflecting the last light of the day. For the first time in years, my hands felt empty and light. I didn't realize how quiet life could be until the voices stopped. For days after returning from France, the silence felt unnatural, almost hollow, as if I'd gone deaf to something essential. The typewriter was gone, left to rust in that broken fountain, but its rhythm still echoed in my head. Click, click, pause, return. Sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I could still hear the keys striking invisible paper. I told myself I'd move on. I even tried to rebuild a routine. Mornings with coffee by the window, afternoons walking along the Thames, evenings with a book I never truly read. But something inside me remained half submerged, like a wreck beneath calm water, unseen but heavy enough to shape every current above it. Then, one morning, an envelope appeared on my doorstep. No stamp, no address, just my name written in pencil. The same shaky handwriting I'd seen on the letters from the box in Caen. My throat tightened as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet, yellowed at the edges with words that stopped me cold. We've been waiting for you to answer. Below that, an address, not in France this time, but in England. It was the address of the military hospital where I'd been treated after the war. A place I hadn't thought about in decades. I didn't hesitate. I packed a coat, caught a train north, and watched the countryside blur into grey and green. When I arrived, the hospital wasn't what I remembered. The old wards were boarded up, the gardens overgrown. A sign out front read, St. Agatha's Home for Veterans, closed since 1972. The front doors were chained, but a side entrance stood slightly open, creaking in the wind. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Damp plaster, mold, and the faint ghost of antiseptic. Dust motes drifted through slivers of light from the broken windows. My footsteps echoed down a corridor lined with peeling paint and half-faded murals of smiling nurses. And then I heard it. Faint, metallic, familiar, click, click, pause, return. The sound came from the far end of the hall. I followed it, pulse quickening, until I reached the old records room. Inside, among rows of rusted filing cabinets, stood a table. On it, impossibly clean, sat my typewriter. It looked exactly as I'd left it. The same scratches on the metal, the same chipped key on the letter A. A single page was rolled into the carriage. The ribbon still red and black. The words on the page read, "Do you remember the last letter?" I didn't, or maybe I didn't want to. I sat down, my hand trembling over the keys. Before I could type a single word, the machine began to move on its own again. Each strike echoed like a heartbeat. "You wrote it here," it said. "The day you woke up." Memories flooded back, fragments I'd buried deep. The hospital bed, the smell of alcohol and smoke, the nurse's voice asking my name. I'd survived the blast that killed my unit, but barely. I'd woken days later in that same room, surrounded by silence, told that I was the only one who made it out alive. Only now, sitting in front of that machine again, did I realize what I'd done next. In the confusion and grief, I had written a letter, not to anyone specific, just to them. To Mason, to the men who didn't make it. The doctors had told me it was good therapy, a way to process trauma. But I'd written more than one. I'd written hundreds, every night, feverish, half delirious. I'd filled page after page with words I didn't remember the next morning, and then I'd locked them away in a box under the bed, the same one I'd found buried in France. The typewriter clacked again, pulling me back. "You gave us your grief," it said. "We gave it back as memory. You carried us in ink. We carried you through guilt. You kept us alive because you didn't know how to die." Tears burned my eyes. My hands hovered over the keys, unsure whether to reply or to pray. Finally I whispered, "What do you want from me?" The carriage slid back on its own. The keys struck 3 final words. Finish the letter. I knew what it meant now. Not a new confession. Not another apology. A final one. The letter that ended the conversation between the living and the dead. I took a deep breath and began to type. The keys slow and deliberate under my fingers. To those I failed to save, I wrote, and to those who saved me by dying. I carried your voices for too long. You were never my ghosts. You were my witnesses. You were the proof that I once belonged to something greater than my fear. I thought guilt was the price of memory, but maybe it's just the shape of love after the war has taken everything else. If any of you still hear me, I'm finally listening. I'm ready to let you go. When I finished, the typewriter didn't move. No mysterious reply appeared. Just silence. Deep, steady, human silence. I left the page in the machine, stood, and walked out of the room. The corridor felt brighter somehow, the dust shimmering like sunlight instead of ash. Outside, the wind carried the faintest echo. Not voices this time, but laughter. The kind I hadn't heard since before Normandy. It faded as I walked down the hill, replaced by the sound of birds and the distant hum of a passing train. I didn't look back. That was 10 years ago. The typewriter remains somewhere in that abandoned hospital, though sometimes on quiet nights I still hear its rhythm in my head, not as something haunting, but as a kind of heartbeat, proof that I'm still here, that they're still remembered. People often ask me if I believe in ghosts. I tell them no, not in the way they think. The dead don't linger to torment us. They linger to remind us that we mattered once and that we still can. I still write, but the letters are different now. They're not to the dead, they're to the living, to the ones trying to build peace inside themselves long after the world stopped shooting, to the ones who still wake up at 3 a.m. hearing echoes of what can't be undone. And sometimes, when the ink runs dry, I imagine Mason sitting beside me, grinning like he used to, saying, "Write faster. We've got all the time in the world." I smile back, finish the page, and close the notebook. For the first time in decades, the silence feels like grace.